Welcome everybody to Kibbe on Liberty. This is a cool episode because I'm going to talk about two of my favorite subjects, beer and freedom. As watchers of this show know, those two things go together intimately. You can't do one without the other, I would argue. And we have two special guests today, Ted from Goodwood Brewing and Oliver from Pacific Legal Foundation. Welcome, guys. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great to be here.
Ted, if you would start, let me just introduce yourself and tell us who you are, and tell us a little bit about Goodwood Brewing.
Well, Ted Mitzlaff. We bought the company in 2005, small production brewery. We grew it when it was easy, when craft beer was kind of exploding. I took it over as managing partner in 2013, and we were in 4 states at the time. We grew it to 16 states pre-COVID, and added a couple locations for food service. So things were good, and we added bourbon a couple of years ago. Then our governor decided he'd shut us down, not once but twice, and it was a different year.
And somehow you connected with Oliver with Pacific Legal Foundation, and you guys are suing the governor, as I understand it, and we'll get into that. But Oliver, tell us about yourself, and just so people have some context, a little bit about Pacific Legal Foundation.
Yeah, thank you. Oliver Dunford. I've been at Pacific Legal Foundation for about 4 years now. We're a libertarian-leaning law firm. Our history has been, at the beginning, was mainly property rights. And that was 1973. Since then, we've expanded. We do free speech, economic liberty. And most recently, we started working on separation of powers cases, which applies here because the governor in Kentucky has decided to take on all powers of government. And that was our interest in the case.
You know, I was personally shocked watching the original lockdowns roll out, particularly in blue states. Kentucky's not really a blue state, but you have a very blue governor. And I was wondering from day one, how on earth can they do this? There didn't seem to be any constitutional limits to their power. And that's obviously what this case is all about, that this governor has exceeded his constitutional powers and has ignored the legislature as well.
Yeah, that's right. Many states, including Kentucky, have emergency powers laws, which allow the governor certain powers when an emergency hits. They vary from state to state. California, for example, has a very, not surprisingly, gives lots of powers to their governor during times of emergency. Kentucky's was fairly broad until just recently. The General Assembly changed the law in January and limited the governor's powers, and most relevant for our case, said that emergency orders lapsed automatically after 30 days unless he got an extension with the General Assembly. But after 30 days, he continued to enforce his orders and said that, no, I have all kinds of inherent power in the executive office to continue the emergency itself, to continue the state of emergency, and to continue issuing orders for as long as I determine is necessary.
And this, Ted, has been devastating to your business, the start and stop and start and stop. And I was sort of slogging through some of the rules on the governor's website. And I don't know how any restaurant or brewery can even comply with this stuff.
No, it never made any sense. Not only was it difficult for us, but all of our clients are bars and restaurants, and we just watched one after another fail. Kentucky's failure rate is somewhere between 25 and 30%, where nationally it's around 17%. The laws made, they were so nonsensical. I'm a chemical engineer. Prior to my life in the brewery world, I owned a chemical company where we did cleaning and sanitation of food processing plants. So I know a little bit about microbes and how they grow and how you kill them. The rules that were put in place where you had to sit outside in a tent inside, but you couldn't sit inside a building, was just, that's crazy. Then once they did open up the restaurants, it was a very limited capacity. You couldn't sit at a bar, but you could sit at a bar at a table. So they put little plexiglass sheets up in between booths, and that made as if the virus couldn't go around the plastic bin. Anyone that could light up, if that were the case, you'd be able to smoke in one booth and not another booth. But obviously, it's going to transfer. So none of these rules made any sense. They were difficult to follow, almost impossible to enforce, and the enforcement was very selective. So it was a cluster from the word go. And we had one of our locations had a very favorable, very friendly health inspector. And when she learned that there was a 50% capacity, she came in, pulled the capacity plaque off of our wall, and put up a new one that had double capacity. So basically, the health inspector's telling us the governor was crazy.
Yeah. There's now data to support that argument. It never really made sense in the first place from my perspective, because I always felt like local knowledge and your ability as a restaurateur or a proprietor to protect your employees and your customers probably was more robust than some governor. And I won't pick on the governor of Kentucky per se, but a lot of governors decided these things from the top down about things that they knew, industries and businesses they knew nothing about in the first place. So you end up with this thing that even, I think it was the Washington Post this week, called COVID safety theater, where we sort of pretend to be cautious about things, but we're doing things that don't really matter at all, just to make bureaucrats feel better about themselves.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate, particularly when you take into account the states that did open early, and they were called Neanderthals and what have you, and their mortality rates were no different than any other state. So it really made no sense. In Kentucky, we're bordered by Indiana and Tennessee. Both states were open, yet Kentucky was closed, or relatively closed. Our patrons were driving across the Ohio River, which is, Louisville borders the Ohio, driving over to southern Indiana, drinking, eating, having fun, and then coming back to Kentucky. So it just, they were worthless, other than, stifling the hospitality industry.
Yeah.
Did a nice job.
So Goodwood Brewing makes both beer, and your specialty is finishing and aging beer in Kentucky barrels, white oak barrels, and you've gotten into the distilling business. Tell me a little bit about the brewing side of the business versus the hospitality restaurant side of the business. What's the balance there? Well,
pre-COVID, we were probably 2/3 hospitality on the revenue. But let me back up. Initially, we were 100% beer distribution. That's all we did, production and distribution. We opened a small tap room in Louisville with food service, and I saw the revenues just were tremendous. So we then opened a full restaurant in Frankfort, Kentucky, with a small brewery, and that's about a $3 million a year location for us. So quickly, I realized just how important that was, not only from a revenue standpoint, but also from a branding standpoint. We get a ton of tourists through there, so they see the products, they have a good experience in our restaurants, and then they're more inclined to purchase it when they're out or when they go back to their own state.
So what was for your business? What was more devastating, the beer side of the business or the restaurant side?
I'd say equally, because the restaurants clearly, they were basically 0% capacity. Then there was limited capacity once we were open. So they did very little. We lost 95%. We went from about 80 employees to 5. But on the even the beer production, our clients were bars and restaurants. 50% of our sales on the production side. So that was devastating to our beer distribution as well. We sold a little bit through carry out. We sold a small amount, still through regular distribution. But because our distributors were so negatively affected, they didn't want to take on any new products either. They wanted to deplete their inventories. So it was chaos. And so if they ran out of Goodwood's lager, when they would get an order, they would say, well, we don't have any Goodwood lager, but we can get you, company X's lager instead. So that's sort of the way it went.
So we've at Free the People, we've talked to a number of businesses that have sort of gone through what you've gone through, and so many of them are being devastated, but not everybody wants to speak up for fear of sort of political or regulatory retaliation. What was the tipping point for you that said, I got to speak up because this isn't just about me anymore. This is about an industry I love.
That's a great question. When Oliver first approached us, Oliver would know the number better than I would, but there were probably 20 people that were rah, let's do this. And then when he said, okay, we're going to step up, we're going to do it, there were 3 of us that stepped forward and did it. I talked to a lot of big restaurant owners, big restaurant chains that are either headquartered in Louisville or headquartered in Lexington. I know the owners well. They were behind us 120%. They were petrified to put their head on the chopping block for the fear of repercussions. And I will tell you, we've had several. I'm going to be audited by the state. That's fine. We also, I was on a statewide ad promoting vaccinations. They took me off the ad. They scrubbed it from the ad, which is, no big deal, but just very petty. We did get a little bit of flack. We got a lot of flack initially from the keyboard cowboys when we first came out that we were suing Beshear. But when it really started to gain momentum, people realized what we were about in our suit, the fact that Oliver was supporting the Constitution of Kentucky, that it really wasn't about whether you have a D or an R next to your name. It's about following the state constitution, following the law. I think everybody pretty much came around.
And how did your customers respond? Did you get any blowback from people that love your beer and maybe not your willingness to speak up?
We did. Certainly, I had a couple doozy emails come through. However, our revenues in both all 3 of our restaurants doubled shortly after this came out. So more people spoke with their wallets than they did with their keyboard.
Oh, that's encouraging to hear, and maybe you'll give some other folks the courage to speak up. Oliver, why don't we dig into the case a little bit and give people a history of how the governor has sort of trampled the Constitution in Kentucky and ignored the legislature?
Yeah, sure. So last year in March, when everything was starting up, the governor declared a state of emergency. And in that order, he specified that he was doing so pursuant to the authorities granted him in Chapter 39A of the statutes. Didn't mention the Constitution, just said I'm doing this pursuant to my statutory authority. As the year went on, he started adding to that and saying in later orders that he was doing it pursuant to the statutory authority and under the Constitution. And that went on for March through January of last year. The one wrinkle in Kentucky, which is similar to other states, is that the legislature in Kentucky is in session only for a short period of time every year. So last year they were out of session, I think in April at some point. And so from April through the end of the year, the governor was allowed to issue the orders and didn't get any pushback, except, of course, there were a number of lawsuits, but there was no pushback from the legislature. And again, depending on how broadly you read the statutes, the governor was exercising authority given to him. He was allowed to declare a state of emergency. He was allowed to issue executive orders. Other agencies in the executive branch were allowed to issue emergency regulations. So at a high level, what the governor did was appropriate. There were some questions about specific orders, and there were some challenges based on First Amendment. But from our perspective, that wasn't our concern, whether or not an individual order was an appropriate balance. And the reason I say that is because in January, when the General Assembly reconvened for the year, It adopted a series of laws, as I mentioned earlier, one of which said executive orders lapse after 30 days. It also said that emergency regulations lapse after 30 days. And another important provision said that if an executive order expires by under the terms of the law, then the governor cannot reissue that order, nor can he continue to execute the emergency authorities under Chapter 39A. And so that law became effective February 2nd. We sued on March 8th, which is a little more than 30 days after all the orders expired. And we said that the governor has no more authority to enforce these orders. And we asked the court for an injunction to prevent the governor from enforcing them against Ted and the other restaurants. And the Scott Circuit Court issued the order.
So you may be aware more than I am, but I believe there's a number of other states that are sort of legislatures pursuing these same sorts of limits on this blank check that governors have used during COVID.
Yeah, there are a number of states that are doing so, and I should mention that one of the laws that was adopted in Kentucky and in other states, Missouri, for example, was based on model legislation that Pacific Legal Foundation's policy shop drafted, and that, again, the main provisions of those are setting a time limit on the governor's authority to issue orders, and then preventing the governor from getting around that expiration date by simply reissuing the orders. I think we're up to something like 10 states now have at least introduced legislation like that, and I don't know, 6 or so have adopted it.
You know, it strikes me that maybe none of us were aware of this amazingly large loophole in the constitutional limits on the executive until COVID, where they just seemed to keep pushing the limit to see how far they could go, and there didn't seem to be any way to stop them, no matter how serious or unserious their proposals were.
Yeah, and I think that the two reasons in this case. One is that for the last not quite 100 years, but courts have just given vast deference to executive agencies and to the government in general. The rule when an issue doesn't involve, say, racial discrimination, in which case the courts will take a close look. If it's just a run-of-the-mill, so-called, like a land use regulation or alcohol regulations, courts will defer to the government, and in fact, the judges will even look for a reason to support the government's actions. It's called the rational basis test. And so if the court can come up with any reason that would justify the government's regulations, it will uphold it. So that's kind of the overall jurisprudence status where we are now, unfortunately. Obviously, one of the things Pacific Legal Foundation wants to do is to get that scrutiny increased, so judges take a closer look at these kinds of things. But the second reason, I think, in this case is because it was a pandemic. There were a lot of things happening quickly. We didn't know exactly what was going on. And in those kinds of cases, the judges are especially reluctant to second guess the executive.
Yeah, I mean, early on, it seems like a radical level of uncertainty would excuse certain things, but as time went on and data showed, you may both be aware that the data in New York, I think going back to March or April of last year, actually explicitly sort of contradicted the Cuomo administration's policies, showing that you had a higher infection rate and a higher hospitalization rate of people that were sheltering in place as opposed to people that were out and about. And that data existed fairly early on. And yet particularly focusing on restaurants and gatherings, those sorts of rules persisted long after the data suggested that it didn't work anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
Even more so.
Go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, even more so with schools. I mean, they closed schools, and children were clearly not the carriers or the risk. I believe there was one death in the U.S. of a child who didn't have pre-existing conditions, and it was crazy the way they went after that.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of I believe the technical term is deaths of despair, and you've seen some horrible data particularly with young people and attempted suicide and that sort of thing. And I, as a beer geek who very much finds, I enjoy beer culture, and I enjoy the sort of community gatherings that happen around local breweries, and that industry has been devastated. But on the consumer side, you don't have that human connection. Um, I assume Goodwood was sort of part of that community gathering culture that makes local beer special.
Very much so. That's one of the things. My favorite thing about operating this company is being able to walk out in the tap room at any given time and mix with the patrons and meet people from all over the country that happen to be passing through Kentucky. Meet locals. You really do find a complete diversity of thought, and it's something that I love and cherish. And frankly, that was robbed. And you're right. I mean, I know several business owners that were crushed through this, that committed suicide. I know, obviously, children. I know that the suicide rates were way up. Drug abuse was way up. Physical abuse was way up. They never talk about the unintended consequences. All they want to talk about are the positivity rates and the deaths.
Yeah. I was reading an industry report for the beer industry showing the shifts that people had to make, and you sort of represent that same sort of shift in your business model. But like, it was a perfect storm where, particularly for the small guys that were pouring to local customers and weren't even in the canning business, and then there was an aluminum shortage, so crowlers and cans were hard to come by, and the
Still
shift,
are.
yeah, and the shift from people drinking as a community gathering to sitting on their couch with a six pack. I mean, all of it is just obviously bad. So let me pivot, because what is the status of the case now, and when will you know? I'll direct this at you, Oliver, but both of you guys feel free to chime in on this. Like, when are you going to get a decision?
Well, we're not sure. As I mentioned earlier, we did get an injunction from the trial court preventing the governor from enforcing the orders just against Ted and our clients, the other clients, not statewide, which the governor tried to make a big deal out of. And so it's just our clients. It was a narrow injunction. The governor immediately moved for emergency relief at the Court of Appeals, and so that order was stayed, which means paused. So so Ted and the other clients were free for a whole week recently, and then the Kentucky Supreme Court took the case up, and we had oral arguments last week. We don't know when, maybe 6 weeks, we'll get an opinion. The governor, after the Supreme Court announced when oral arguments would take place, which was June 10th, a few days later, the governor announced that all of the restrictions would be lifted on June 11th. And so at the oral argument, the governor's lawyer said there's really no reason to keep this injunction in place anymore. You should just vacate it. And we said, no, the governor maintains he still has these powers. We think this needs to stay in place, because he could come back on June 12th and say, no, we need to put these orders back in. If cases spike again in the fall, he could do it again. So we're waiting right now. Currently, Ted is now freed. The governor has graciously allowed the restaurants to reopen, but he has not relinquished his powers.
Do you feel blessed, Ted, that the governor is giving you at least partial rights to run your business?
Oh yeah, tremendously. What was I found most distasteful was more than once his attorney was arguing against something that Oliver had put in our case, which I believe was spot on, was the fact that a lot of these powers that he inflicted on us and the restrictions were irreversible. And she kept saying that it was not irreversible. I'd like her to tell that to the business owner that lost his business, lost his house, to the folks that committed suicide because they couldn't handle the lockdown. That seems pretty irreversible to me.
Yeah, I unfortunately, I think I know the answer to this. Oliver, is there any remedy legally if you win for people that were either damaged or destroyed by the arbitrary nature of these orders?
No, governors can make mistakes, and there's no remedy outside of there's a narrow allowance for if they violate your civil rights. But in this case, as broadly applicable, it's hard to argue that the restaurants or our clients were denied civil rights that that everyone else was allowed to exercise. So, but as general rule, no, you can't recover damages from the government.
I can't help but notice, and maybe your case had something to do with the sudden change of heart from the governor's office. Do you feel like the case itself forced the governor to retreat from his more aggressive position?
I think so. He had there were a number of lawsuits last year, as I mentioned. Those were ultimately unsuccessful. I think the benefit of ours was, again, we didn't necessarily challenge the substance of the orders. We didn't say that his orders were a bad idea. We didn't say that the new legislation was a good idea. We simply said, here's what the law says, and the governor has to follow it. And the numbers have gotten better. There's no question about it. But some of his announcements seem to tie up with what happened in our case. And so I think we did speed things along. At least I hope we did.
Yeah. Ted, I have to ask, you've stuck your neck out, and you've sort of taken a beating under these orders. The lockdowns are over. Why are you persisting?
Well, sometimes being right and taking a stand is not easy, and I'm very grateful that Oliver took our case. The last thing I want to do is pick a fight with my governor, but sometimes you've got to do what's right, and you've got to. I believe firmly in the Constitution. My grandfather died defending it in World War II, and I intend to continue his legacy.
Does this case, if you are successful here, will this case have implications for other states? Is it I know it's not a explicit precedent, but does something happen if you guys win?
Yeah, as you said, it's not going to be binding on any other states, but I think courts around the country pay attention to what other courts do, and they're going to, for example, if California does something, it seems to have an effect. So I think a win here would tell the rest of the country that it's possible to respond to an emergency without simply relying on one person.
And perhaps the point is that now that the governors have discovered this loophole, it strikes me that they are likely to jump on the next opportunity to use it to expand their power. So this is really about the next emergency that we don't even know about, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The claims of necessity are always raised, and they can justify just about anything. And I think Governor Newsom in California just declared a state of emergency because of forest fires, or maybe it was extreme heat, something, which again may be a legitimate declaration there. But the precedent's certainly been set over the last year that the governors will push the envelope. One thing that the governor's lawyers kept arguing is that Kentucky needed a unified statewide policy. But as Ted mentioned, Indiana and Tennessee were open, and Governor Beshear didn't lock down the borders in Kentucky. So it's an arbitrary, in some respects, it's an arbitrary idea that you need to have a statewide response. And Matt, as you said at the beginning, individuals and businesses have their own responsibilities and have every incentive to take care of themselves and their customers.
We saw that same dynamic with hospitals, and there were statewide responses to managing emergency flow for COVID patients into hospitals. And it treated rural hospitals and city center hospitals and specialty hospitals, and every single hospital has a different community that they serve and different specialties and different local knowledge. And it turned out disastrously for patients and hospitals across the country, because one size fits all just doesn't make any sense. And that used to be common sense, but this centralized approach to things, it didn't make sense to me, even in the early days when we didn't know anything about what was happening, because my perspective as economist is like the whole point of decentralized local knowledge is your ability to figure out things, particularly when you don't know what's going on. And one person can make a horrible mistake, and if they're in charge of everything, you're really screwed. But if one person at the local level makes a mistake, other people can sort of step in and help fix that. And that was sort of my liberty instinct going into this. And fortunately or unfortunately, it turns out that that's exactly the framework we should have followed instead of the Kentucky Governor Beshear framework.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And one thing that happened later on, again, a pause at the beginning. Okay, I think everyone thought that was reasonable, but it got to the point where we were afraid to take any risks. And as both you and Ted have mentioned, the unintended consequences, the harms that were caused by the lockdowns themselves, were often ignored. To the point where when the Johnson & Johnson vaccine came out and there were some, 1 in a million cases of blood clots, suddenly it became too much of a risk to take the vaccine, even though the vaccine was obviously better than getting COVID itself. And so it just got taken to an extreme, and yeah, people just forgot about common sense in the last year.
Let me pivot to something more uplifting. And Ted, you mentioned that you're a chemical engineer by training, but you got into the beer business, and I mentioned earlier on that I love to talk about beer and freedom, and I view particularly the American craft beer industry as a beautiful metaphor for the things that can happen when people are free to experiment and create and start businesses. And it's kind of a metaphor for entrepreneurship. And one of the things I noticed about your brewery is that you're doing something that it's not uncommon anymore in the craft beer industry, but I think you're taking it a little bit further, is finishing and aging a lot of your beers in barrels. Where did that come from? And that has to cost more, right? Like, doesn't that undermine the bottom line?
It costs more, but hopefully you can make it up with resale at a higher point. But we live in Bourbon Mecca. I am literally blocks from Angel's Envy, Rabbit Hole, Copper and Kings, Old Forester, Peerless. They're all within a mile radius. Evan Williams. So access to barrels for us is easy. We want freshly dumped, good premium bourbon barrels. Then there was an aftermarket, it still is, for furniture, big aftermarket, selling to either furniture makers or back to cooperage companies that would then break them apart, send them to Scotland, and they reassemble them and make scotch, but scotch in them. But I grew up a bourbon guy. I was a bourbon guy before I was a beer guy, and decided that it'd be fun to start experimenting with bourbon finished in beer barrels, and that sort of created a life of its own. We did a bourbon barrel stout and a brandy barrel honey ale variant from our beers, where we finished bourbon in those barrels, and we actually won gold in San Francisco in the San Francisco Spirits competition with our bourbon in our brandy barrels, and that was our third effort at a bourbon. So I think we've got something pretty good, and it's growing quickly, and I intend to break ground on a distillery in the not too terribly distant future.
In Louisville or
it'll be in Kentucky, but I'm still negotiating price on the land, so I don't want to let them know where we're going.
Yeah, we won't let that secret out. But you have 3 pubs now, and you're in Lexington and Bardstown.
Lexington and Frankfort, in Louisville, getting ready to open Indianapolis in 2 weeks. Unfortunately, that was a brew pub that went out of business, and then we signed a lease for a new brew pub in Owensboro today.
Nice. So you have sort of it's a combination of entrepreneurship and artistry, where you just love what you do.
We love what we do, and we've got a great team, and as long as the governor doesn't shut us down, we're going to keep going forward.
But you're sort of hedging your bets by moving to the freer state of Indianapolis. Absolutely. Maybe we could annex Louisville and have it join Indiana like they're trying to do in Oregon with Idaho. Yeah. So how do if people want to check you out, how do they find your beer? I mean, I know you distribute as well, but how do people try Goodwood beer?
Well, obviously our tap rooms, we're in the 16 states, or 10 post-COVID that were distributed. We're in most big chain stores, Kroger's, Total Wines, those types, a lot of independent stores. But with legislation that we got through last year, you can now do beer order. So they can actually go to our website, goodwood.beer, and place an order for any of our beers or our bourbon.
And are the pubs and restaurants at 100% now? They're fully open again?
They are, but now, of course, everybody's fighting the labor shortage.
Yeah.
So there's another government mandate that's kind of gone awry. So hopefully by September, our governor hasn't taken his foot off that. So it is very difficult right now to fully staff your bar or restaurant.
It's more lucrative to not work still.
It is difficult to compete when the governor's paying somebody more to stay at home than we can pay them, unless somebody wants to pay $20 a six pack to come to work.
I've noticed this every restaurant that I've gone to. I live in Washington D.C. and our rules may in fact be more oppressive than anything that Governor Beshear has done. But I tip aggressively because I really appreciate people that want to work right now, because I understand how lucrative it is not to work.
Yes, and it's greatly appreciated.
Yeah. Oliver, tell us about, I mean, you're almost guaranteeing a win is what I'm hearing. You never lose, right?
That's right. We never lose. No, we hope so. We tend to take cases where the odds are kind of long, just because our goal is to change precedent and to challenge some of the aggressive overreach by government. Ted just mentioned that they had new legislation to allow them to sell beer online. One of the other things that the Governor Beshear loosened is that bars were now allowed to sell beer alcohol to go, which previously had been restricted for who knows what reason. So we tend to that we're challenging entrenched jurisprudence, and so this case presents a nice issue because it's really clean. We think. Again, we didn't get into the substance. We weren't telling Governor Beshear he was wrong, that he was making improper orders. We just said your authority has now run out. You need to follow the law just like everybody else. So we're hopeful that the argument is clean and doesn't take any creative writing or mental gymnastics by the court. But again, the governor's decision to lift the restrictions the day after oral argument certainly complicates it. It can give the court an out if it wants it. I don't think it should. I think our case remains a live case and the issues remain important. And so I think the court should issue a ruling, but you never know.
You never know. So I'm a big fan of Pacific Legal. Tell everybody how they can check out not just your cases, but all the work that Pacific Legal Foundation does.
Yeah, please go to pacificlegal.org. Check out. We have we're waiting for a case actually, which will be released next week from the United States Supreme Court that was argued earlier this year. So we keep working and trying to get these cases up to the high courts in the state and the U.S. Supreme Court.
Cool. So Ted, I'm going to look you up next time I'm in bourbon country, because my wife and I do another talk. Not only am I a beer geek, but I'm a bourbon geek, and we do a talk called Whiskey is Freedom. So I feel like we're going to have to do some field research at your pub.
I would love to host you and your wife. That'd be great.
Thank you both for your time, and hopefully the good guys win on this one.
Thanks so much for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Happy Father's Day.
That was amazing. Where can I get more content just like that? It's a great question. You're clearly a discerning consumer of the best content. Make sure to like the video, subscribe, and click the bell. And if you're consuming podcasts, go to Apple, Stitcher, anywhere you get them. I'm in. Kibbe on Liberty, honest conversations with interesting people.